On January 11th, 1942, at approximately 0800 hours, the Japanese 65th Brigade launched a coordinated assault against the Abukai defensive line on the Bataan Peninsula in the Philippines. Their target was the 57th Infantry Regiment, Philippine Scouts, holding the critical lowland sector that flanked the only major road into the peninsula. The 57th Infantry was one of the most professional units in General Douglas MacArthur's command. Unlike the hastily mobilized Philippine Army divisions, the Scouts were regular United States Army soldiers, Filipino enlisted men, American officers, years of training, expert marksmanship. They had been fighting since the Japanese invasion began 4 weeks earlier. They were exhausted, running low on food, half rations for 2 weeks. Disease was spreading, malaria, dysentery, but they were still professional soldiers. And on the morning of January 11th, they were about to demonstrate why they were considered the backbone of American defense in the Philippines. The problem facing defenders across Bataan was simple mathematics. The Japanese had numbers. They could mass forces, launch human wave attacks, overwhelm positions through sheer volume. American and Filipino forces were outnumbered 3-1. To hold, defenders needed every advantage they could get. Firepower was the most important advantage, the ability to deliver enough bullets downrange to stop an attack before it reached your position. That came down to weapons. What rifle you carried determined how much firepower you could deliver. Most American units in the Philippines carried M1903 Springfield rifles. Bolt action, 5 rounds, manually operated. To fire the next shot, you pulled the bolt handle up, back, forward, down. Ejected the spent cartridge, chambered a new round. The motion required moving your hands, breaking your sight picture, reacquiring the target. A trained rifleman could fire 15 to 20 aimed shots per minute with a Springfield that was adequate for long-range shooting. But in close combat, in jungle fighting, when Japanese soldiers were charging across 100 yards of terrain, 15 shots per minute wasn't enough. The Japanese carried Type 99 Arisaka rifles, also bolt action, also 5 rounds. Same problem. But Japanese tactics compensated. They used mass charges, banzai attacks, overwhelming defenders with numbers before the defenders could fire enough rounds to stop them. It worked repeatedly across Bataan in December and early January. American positions fell not because soldiers lacked courage, but because they couldn't deliver enough firepower fast enough. Some units had a different weapon. The M1 Garand, semi-automatic, gas-operated, 8 rounds, .30-06 Springfield cartridge, 9.5 pounds, 43.6 inches long. The rifle fired, then automatically ejected the spent cartridge, chambered. The next round was ready to fire again. All the soldier did was pull the trigger. No manual bolt operation, no breaking the sight picture, just continuous fire as fast as you could pull the trigger. The rate of fire difference was dramatic. A trained soldier with an M1 Garand could fire 40 to 50 aim shots per minute, triple the rate of fire of a bolt action rifle. That difference was the margin between stopping an attack and being overrun. The M1 Garand had been adopted by the United States Army as standard issue in 1936. By December of 1941, the Army had maybe 200,000 M1s total. That wasn't enough to equip every unit. Priority went to units training in the United States, then units deploying to Europe, then Hawaii. The Philippines got partial allocations. The 57th Infantry Regiment received M1 Garands for some companies. Not all, not even most. But enough that when the Japanese attacked on January 11th, some Philippine scouts were carrying semi-automatic rifles, while most other defenders still had Springfields. The 57th Infantry Regiment had been in continuous contact with Japanese forces since late December. They fought delaying actions near Lingayen Gulf, covering the withdrawal of other units to Bataan. They took casualties. They gave ground when ordered. But they inflicted heavy losses on advancing Japanese forces. Japanese commanders learned to respect the scouts. These were not the poorly trained Philippine Army reservists who broke and ran. These were professional soldiers who knew how to shoot, how to maneuver, how to hold ground. Attacking scout positions was costly. On January 9th, the Japanese launched their first major assault on the Abukai line. The 57th held the most critical sector, the lowland area flanking the main road. If the Japanese broke through there, they could drive straight down the peninsula and cut off all forces north of the breakthrough. The scouts had to hold. For 2 days, they fought off probing attacks. Then on the morning of January 11th, the Japanese committed everything they had to a major assault. The 65th Brigade, veteran troops experienced in jungle fighting, confident after unbroken victories across Southeast Asia. They attacked in waves, hundreds of men advancing through the jungle using terrain for cover, moving by rushes, professional infantry, executing standard tactics. The scouts opened fire at 150 yards. The sound was different from previous engagements. Not the slow, methodical crack, crack, crack of bolt-action rifles being fired carefully, one shot at a time. This was sustained rapid fire, continuous shooting, like a sustained drum roll. The Japanese advance stalled. Men dove for cover. Officers looked for machine gun positions. Where were the automatic weapons? The fire was coming from individual foxholes, single soldiers. But the rate of fire didn't match bolt action. Rifles. It couldn't. One man with a manually operated rifle couldn't maintain that tempo. The Japanese tried to advance again. Same result. Continuous fire. Men falling. The attack broke apart. Units pulled back to regroup. They tried flanking movements. The fire shifted to follow them. No gaps. No pauses. The defenders weren't reloading long enough for the Japanese to exploit breaks in fire. It was extraordinary. Japanese officers had fought American forces with Springfield rifles for weeks. They knew the timing. They knew when defenders would be cycling bolts, when they'd be reloading. And that timing was the key to successful attacks. Get close while they're reloading. Charge the final distance before they can get their rifles back in action. But these defenders weren't following the pattern. They kept firing. By mid-morning, the Japanese attack had completely stalled. The 65th Brigade took heavy casualties and withdrew. The Abuke line held. The scouts had stopped a brigade-level assault with a fraction of the Japanese force strength. The difference was firepower. The difference was the M1 Garand. Colonel Philip T. Fry commanded the 57th Infantry Regiment from January 21st to January 29th, 1942. He had served with the regiment since earlier years and knew his men well. He knew their capabilities. He knew their weapons. After witnessing the scouts' performance with M1 Garands during the January fighting, Fry submitted reports to higher command describing the rifle's effectiveness. His assessment would become one of the most famous quotes about the M1 Garand in combat. The firepower of a battalion armed with modern weapons is something. The Garand rifle is beyond my descriptive powers. That quote captured what everyone who witnessed M1 Garands in combat understood immediately. The rifle changed infantry combat fundamentally. It gave every rifleman firepower that previous generations had reserved for machine gun crews. It spread lethal capability across the entire defensive line. One man with a Garand delivered firepower equivalent to 2 or 3 men with bolt-action rifles. That multiplied force effectiveness instantly. But there weren't enough Garands to go around. Production in the United States was accelerating, but demand far exceeded supply. The entire Army was transitioning from Springfields to Garands. Every unit wanted them. MacArthur had requested 84,500 M1s in August 1941. He received only partial allocations before the Japanese invasion cut off all resupply. The Philippine Department got maybe 3,000 M1s total. Those rifles went to the best units first, the Philippine Division, the 57th Infantry, the 45th Infantry, units that could use them most effectively. But even in those units, not everyone had Garands. Most soldiers still carried Springfields. The rifles went to frontline infantry first. Support. Units kept bolt actions. The supply shortage created an underground economy. Soldiers with Garands became targets of acquisition efforts. If you set your rifle down, someone might take it. Units hoarded them. Officers requisitioned them and found them missing the next morning. The black market value of an M1 Garand on Bataan in January 1942 exceeded a month's pay. Some soldiers traded them for extra rations or medicine. Most refused at any price. They knew what they had, a weapon that might keep them alive. The production challenge facing the United States in 1941 and 42 was immense. Springfield Armory could produce maybe 40,000 M1s per year working at full capacity. That wasn't nearly enough. The Army was expanding rapidly. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers needed rifles. The Army still had millions of Springfield bolt actions in storage from World War I, and those could be issued immediately. But the M1 was clearly superior. Military planners wanted every soldier equipped with Garands as soon as possible. Winchester. Repeating arms was brought into M1 production in 1941. Winchester was a major firearms manufacturer with extensive facilities, but they needed time to retool production lines for the Garand. The rifle was complex. It required different machinery and different processes than Winchester's existing products. Engineers from Springfield Armory traveled to Winchester to help set up production. They brought blueprints, specifications, sample parts, and tooling diagrams. Winchester workers had to be trained on the new rifle. Machinists had to learn new tolerances. Inspectors had to learn new standards. Winchester's first M1s came off the production line in early 1941. Initial production was slow as workers learned the process. But by mid-1941, Winchester was producing thousands of M1s per month. By late 1942, Winchester production matched Springfield Armory. Together, the two facilities were building perhaps 100,000 M1s per month. That still wasn't enough to equip every unit immediately, but it was enough to begin systematic distribution. Distribution priority was a constant source of friction. Every unit wanted M1s. Training divisions in the United States argued they needed them to properly prepare soldiers for combat. Units deploying to Europe argued they needed them because they were going into combat immediately. Units deploying to the Pacific made the same argument. Units already overseas argued they needed them most because they were already fighting. MacArthur in the Philippines requested 84,500 M1s in August 1941, 3 months before the Japanese invasion. He was told production limitations made that impossible. He received partial allocations through the fall. Maybe 3,000 rifles total reached the Philippines before December. Those went to the best units: the Philippine Division, the Scouts, professional soldiers who could use them most effectively. Second Lieutenant Alexander R. Nineker, Jr. was assigned to the 57th Infantry Regiment in November 1941, fresh from West Point. Class of 1941, 23 years old, posted to the Philippines just weeks before the war started. On January 12, 1942, Nininger's company was not engaged in heavy combat. Another unit nearby was under attack. Nininger voluntarily attached himself to that unit. He grabbed his rifle and went forward into the fight. What happened next would earn him the first Medal of Honor awarded to any American soldier in World War II. Nininger engaged Japanese forces at close range, hand-to-hand fighting. He forced his way into enemy positions repeatedly, killed enemy soldiers with rifle fire and grenades. He was wounded. He kept fighting, wounded again, kept fighting. Finally, he was hit by fire that killed him. But his actions broke the Japanese attack at that section of the line. Other defenders held because Nininger had disrupted the assault. He died doing what soldiers do, going forward when others need help, putting himself at risk to protect his unit, using his weapon to maximum effect. The weapon he carried that day was an M1 Garand. It allowed him to deliver sustained fire without pausing to work a bolt. That continuous firepower gave him the capability to hold off multiple attackers long enough to matter. Nininger was the first of 3 Philippine scouts to earn Medals of Honor on baton. Sergeant Jose Calugas of 88th. Field Artillery earned his on January 6th. First Lieutenant Willibald C. Bianchi of 40. 5th Infantry earned his on February 3rd. All 3 citations describe actions where soldiers moved forward under fire, engaged enemy forces aggressively, and delivered effective fire despite being wounded or outnumbered. The pattern was consistent. These were professional soldiers who knew how to fight. They had weapons that let them fight effectively. They used those weapons to maximum capability. The Japanese noticed the firepower difference immediately. Combat reports from Japanese units in January mentioned unexpectedly heavy automatic weapons fire from American positions. Intelligence officers noted that single American soldiers appeared to be delivering fire consistent with light machine guns. Unit commanders reported difficulty advancing against what they described as concentrated automatic fire from positions that appeared lightly defended. The reports were confused. Japanese intelligence knew Americans used Springfield bolt action rifles as standard issue. That was documented, confirmed from earlier combat. But something had changed. American firepower had increased dramatically. Where was it coming from? By mid-January, Japanese forces had captured enough M1 Garands from battlefield losses to examine them. They sent several rifles back to Japan for detailed analysis. Engineers at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal disassembled the weapons, studied the operating system, measured components. Their conclusion was straightforward. The M1 was a well-designed semi-automatic rifle, gas-operated, reliable, capable of sustained rapid fire, and probably impossible for Japan to manufacture without completely retooling factories. The Japanese industrial base was set up for bolt-action rifles, machine guns, and artillery. Semi-automatic rifles had never been a priority. Now they were fighting an enemy where every infantryman had firepower equivalent to specialized weapons teams. The strategic implications were obvious. Japanese commanders tried to adapt tactics, avoid prolonged firefights with American positions, use artillery and mortars to suppress defenders from distance, then assault quickly before they could recover, minimize exposure to American rifle fire. The adjustments helped, but didn't solve the fundamental problem. In straight infantry engagements at close range, Americans had a firepower advantage. Japanese forces needed numerical superiority or artillery support or terrain advantage to compensate. By April, the situation on Bataan had deteriorated beyond recovery. Food was exhausted, ammunition was critically low, disease had incapacitated thousands. The Japanese had reinforcements. The Americans had nothing. No supplies, no reinforcements, no hope of relief. The naval blockade was complete. On April 9th, Major General Edward P. King surrendered American and Filipino forces on Bataan. 76,000 men became prisoners of war, approximately 16,000 Americans, 60,000 Filipinos. Most still carried Springfield rifles. The soldiers with Garans had fought until their ammunition was gone. Some destroyed their rifles before surrendering, smashed actions, bent barrels, made sure the Japanese couldn't use them. What followed was one of the worst atrocities in modern warfare. The Bataan Death March. Japanese forces marched 76,000 prisoners 65 miles up the Bataan Peninsula in tropical heat. No food, no water, no medical care. Guards beat prisoners, shot those who fell, bayoneted those who stopped for water. Between 7,000 and 10,000 men died on the march. Another 26,000 died at Camp O'Donnell over the next 8 months. Starvation, disease, brutal conditions. The Philippine scouts who survived the march continued to demonstrate the discipline that defined them as soldiers. They helped each other, picked up those who fell, shared what little they had. Many escaped and joined guerrilla forces to continue fighting. Philip Fry survived the Bataan Death March and 3.5 years in Japanese prison camps. He was liberated in August 1945 and returned to the United States. He lived until July 22, 1959. His assessment of the M1 Garand's combat effectiveness became one of the most cited testimonials about the weapon. Beyond my descriptive powers, that phrase captured what was difficult to quantify: the psychological impact of sustained fire, the confidence it gave defenders, the fear it created in attackers. Numbers could show rate of fire differences, 40 shots per minute versus 15, but numbers couldn't capture what it meant to be a soldier holding ground against superior numbers and knowing your weapon could deliver continuous fire without pause. By late 1942, M1 production in the United States had finally reached levels needed to equip entire divisions. The 164th Infantry Regiment, North Dakota National Guard, part of the Americal Division, arrived on Guadalcanal on October 13, 1942, carrying M1 Garands as standard issue. The regiment consisted of approximately 3,000 men, mostly from North Dakota, with additional soldiers from other states. Almost every rifleman in the regiment carried an M1. The few who didn't carried M1 carbines or specialized weapons like the Browning automatic rifle. This was the first time an entire United States Army regiment landed in combat with semi-automatic rifles as standard issue. The Marines on Guadalcanal had been fighting since August 7th with primarily Springfield bolt actions. The 1st Marine Division had landed with M1903 rifles as their standard weapon. Some specialized units had M1s, defense battalions, some artillery units, small numbers in headquarters companies. But the infantry regiments doing the actual jungle fighting had Springfields. They had been requesting Garands for months. The Marine Corps had officially adopted the M1 in June 1942, but distribution was slow. Rifles went to units, training in the United States first. Units already deployed overseas got them last. When the 164th Infantry landed on October 13th, Marines immediately noticed what the Army soldiers were carrying. New rifles, semi-automatic, 8 rounds, fast reload. The Marines had been fighting for 2 months with bolt actions. They knew what combat on Guadalcanal required: jungle fighting, close-range engagements, ambushes, night attacks, situations where rate of fire mattered more than long-range precision. The Garand was perfect for that kind of fighting. The Springfield was not. Marine units began acquiring M1s through unofficial channels. The Marines had a long tradition of procuring equipment through creative means. If another service had something you needed and you could obtain it without getting caught, you obtained it. M1. Garands fell into that category. Some Marines traded for them: a bottle of captured Japanese sake for a rifle, a Japanese battle flag for a rifle, personal items, souvenirs, anything that might convince an Army soldier to part with his weapon. Most Army soldiers weren't willing to trade. Their rifles were important. They needed them for combat. But some traded anyway, usually soldiers and rear echelon units who didn't expect to see combat and wanted souvenirs more than rifles. The trades were technically unauthorized. Both the soldier giving up his rifle and the Marine receiving it were violating regulations. But regulations seemed less important than practical needs in combat zones. Other Marines simply took rifles when opportunities presented themselves. If an Army soldier set down his Garand and walked away, a Marine might pick it up. If a supply crate was unguarded, rifles might disappear. The practice became common enough that Army officers started posting guards on supply areas, specifically to prevent Marine acquisition. That didn't stop it entirely. Marines found ways. They were resourceful. They wanted those rifles. They were willing to work for them. The situation created some friction between Army and Marine units, but it was mostly good-natured. Both services respected each other's fighting abilities. Marines envied the Army's equipment. Army soldiers respected the Marines' fighting record on Guadalcanal. The rifle acquisitions were more like friendly competition than actual theft. Army units tried to keep their rifles. Marines tried to acquire them. Both sides understood the game. When the 1st Marine Division prepared to leave Guadalcanal in December, word came down that all M1 Garands had to be returned to Army units. The rifles were Army property. They needed to stay with Army units on the island. Marine commanders informed their men. All Garands were to be turned in before embarking on ships. Army officers would be stationed at embarkation points to collect rifles and issue receipts. Many Marines reluctantly returned their Garands. They turned them in, got receipts, boarded ships carrying Springfield bolt actions again. But some Marines managed to keep their M1s anyway. They smuggled them aboard ships in duffel bags, wrapped in ponchos, hidden in equipment. Some Marines cooperated with sympathetic Army soldiers who looked the other way during inspections. Some simply walked aboard carrying their rifles openly, and nobody questioned them. Estimates vary, but probably several hundred Garands left Guadalcanal with the 1st Marine Division despite official efforts to recover them. Those rifles were carried to subsequent battles in the Solomons. The 164th Infantry's commander was Colonel Bryant E. Moore. He understood the M1's value immediately. Moore told his soldiers to train with their rifles constantly, fire fast, reload fast, trust the weapon. When the regiment went into combat, Moore's men applied the same principles that had worked on Bataan: sustained fire, continuous pressure, overwhelming firepower from individual riflemen. The Japanese faced the same problem they had encountered in the Philippines. American infantry, who could fire as fast as machine guns. Japanese. Charges that should have succeeded, based on experience against bolt-action rifles, failed against Garands. Corporal Kenneth S. Foubert of the 164th Infantry became the first United States Army soldier to die in offensive combat operations in the Pacific Theater after Pearl Harbor. He was killed on October 13, 1942, the day his regiment landed on Guadalcanal. Japanese aircraft bombed the landing area. Shrapnel struck Foubert as he came ashore. He died on the beach. Thousands of Army soldiers had died in defensive operations in the Philippines from December 1941 to May 1942. But Foubert was the first killed during an American offensive operation. His death marked the beginning of America's ground offensive in the Pacific. By November 1942, American intelligence began receiving reports from captured Japanese soldiers describing their experiences facing M1 Garands. The reports were remarkably consistent. Japanese prisoners described American rifle fire as resembling automatic weapons. They said individual American soldiers delivered sustained fire that couldn't possibly come from manually operated rifles. When interrogators showed them M1s and explained they were semi-automatic rifles, not machine guns, many prisoners were surprised. They had assumed they were facing specialized automatic weapons, not standard-issue rifles. These interrogation reports reached higher command levels. They were compiled into assessments of American weapons effectiveness. The conclusions validated what frontline units already knew. The M1 Garand gave American infantry a decisive firepower advantage in close combat. That advantage saved lives. It won engagements. It compensated for numerical disadvantages. The rifle worked in mud, in sand, in jungle humidity, in Arctic cold. Soldiers learned to trust it completely. General George S. Patton commanded armored and infantry forces across North Africa, Sicily, France, and Germany. He was famously difficult to impress. Equipment had to work, tactics had to succeed, soldiers had to fight. Patton didn't tolerate incompetence or equipment failure. On January 26, 1945, Patton wrote to Major General Levin H. Campbell, Jr., Chief of Ordnance. The letter praised the M1 Garand. In my opinion, the M1 rifle is the greatest battle implement ever devised. That assessment came from direct observation. Patton had watched his soldiers fight across two theaters. He knew what weapons worked. The Garand worked. It gave American infantry an edge that German forces couldn't match. Patton made sure his units had Garands and knew how to use them properly. Maximum rate of fire, aggressive tactics, overwhelming the enemy with firepower. German soldiers who faced American infantry in Europe noticed the same firepower disparity Japanese soldiers had noticed in the Pacific. German infantry carried Kar 98 KO rifles. Bolt action. 5 rounds. Excellent weapons for precision shooting, but slow in close combat. When American infantry closed to 200 yards and started firing Garens, German soldiers couldn't match the volume of fire. German after-action reports from Normandy describe American suppression fire as intense. Individual American riflemen could pin down entire German squads. German tactical doctrine relied heavily on MG 42 machine guns, 1 or 2 machine guns per squad providing suppression while riflemen maneuvered. But American squads didn't need to rely entirely on machine guns. Every rifleman had semi-automatic capability that spread suppression across the entire squad. Even if the machine gunner was killed, 7 or 8 men with Garands could maintain fire. By 1944, the M1 Garand had become the symbol of American infantry. When soldiers landed at Normandy, they carried Garands. When Marines assaulted Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, they carried Garands. The rifle performed reliably across every environment: desert heat, jungle humidity, European winter. It functioned in conditions that stopped other weapons: mud, sand, salt water, snow. Soldiers maintained their rifles as best they could under combat conditions. The rifles kept working. Total M1 Garand production during World War II reached approximately 5.4 million rifles. Springfield Armory in Winchester. Repeating Arms built them as fast as production capacity allowed. By 1945, virtually every American infantry unit in both theaters carried M1s as standard issue. The Springfield bolt action had been relegated to sniper rifles and training weapons. The transition was complete. American infantry fought with semi-automatic rifles. That gave them an advantage no other major combatant possessed at that scale. The Japanese finally attempted to produce their own semi-automatic rifle in 1944. The Imperial Japanese Navy took the lead because they controlled facilities capable of precision manufacturing. The decision to develop a semi-automatic rifle came from direct combat experience. By 1943, Japanese commanders throughout the Pacific had submitted reports describing American firepower superiority. Those reports were remarkably consistent. American infantry delivered sustained fire that Japanese infantry couldn't match. In close combat engagements, American soldiers could fire 2 to 3 times as many rounds as Japanese soldiers in the same time period. That firepower advantage was decisive. Japanese attacks that should have succeeded based on numerical superiority were failing because American defenders could deliver enough fire to stop them. Japanese military planners faced a difficult decision. They could continue producing bolt-action rifles using existing factories and tooling, or they could invest in developing and producing semi-automatic rifles. The first option was cheaper and faster, but left Japanese infantry at a permanent disadvantage. The second option would take years and require retooling factories that were already operating at maximum capacity, producing weapons for the ongoing war. The Imperial Japanese Navy chose to proceed with semi-automatic rifle development. The Navy had more control over its weapons procurement than the Army did. The Navy also had access to Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, one of Japan's most advanced manufacturing facilities. Yokosuka had precision machine tools and skilled workers capable of handling complex designs. Engineers at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal studied captured M1 Garands extensively. They disassembled them completely, measured every component, analyzed the metallurgy, examined the gas operating system in detail. They concluded that directly copying the M1 was not feasible. The Ion Block's clip system that worked well with American .30-06 ammunition didn't work reliably with Japanese 7.7mm ammunition. The cartridge dimensions were slightly different. The clip wouldn't feed properly. Attempting to rechamber captured M1s for Japanese ammunition resulted in feeding failures and jams. The solution was to develop a modified design. The Type 4 rifle would copy the M1's gas operating system, its rotating bolt, and its overall operating principle. But the magazine would be different. Instead of an 8-round en-bloc clip, the Type 4 would use a fixed internal 10-round magazine, fed by 2 standard 5-round stripper clips. This allowed the use of existing ammunition clips already in production for Type 99 Arisaka rifles. It also solved the feeding problems that plagued attempts to use en-bloc clips with Japanese ammunition. Development of the Type 4 began in early 1944. The first prototypes were hand-built and tested extensively. Engineers refined the design based on test results. By late 1944, the design was finalized and production tooling was being manufactured. Production began in earnest in early 1945. Yokosuka produced approximately 250 Type 4 rifles by August 1945, when Japan surrendered. Another 100 rifles were partially assembled, waiting for final components. Parts for several hundred more rifles were in various stages of manufacture. The rifles never saw combat. They remained in storage at Yokosuka until American occupation forces arrived in September 1945. American weapons experts examined the Type 4 rifles with interest. They recognized the design as a clear derivative of the M1 Garand. The operating system was nearly identical. The quality of manufacture was good. The rifles functioned reliably in testing. If Japan had been able to produce them earlier, and in larger quantities, they might have narrowed the firepower gap that American forces exploited throughout the Pacific War. But by the time Japan could manufacture semi-automatic rifles, the outcome of the war was already determined. The program came too late to matter. The M1 Garand remained in American service until 1957. It fought in Korea with the same effectiveness it had shown in World War II. When North Korean forces invaded South Korea on June 25, 1950, American units deployed to stop them carried M1s as standard issue. The rifle performed just as reliably in Korea as it had in the Philippines, Guadalcanal, North Africa, Sicily, France, and Germany. Korea presented different challenges than World War II. The terrain was mountainous, winters were brutal, temperatures dropped to 20 below zero Fahrenheit in some areas. Many weapons failed in extreme cold. Lubricants froze, action ceased, but the M1 kept functioning when properly maintained. During the Battle of Chosin Reservoir in late 1950, temperatures reached minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Marines and Army soldiers found that standard lubricants thickened and gummed up in the extreme cold. The solution was to remove all lubricant from the rifles and run them dry. Without oil, the metal-to-metal contact created more wear, but the rifles continued to function. The M1's design was robust enough to operate without lubrication in emergency situations. American infantry in Korea maintained firepower superiority over Chinese and North Korean forces. Chinese soldiers were armed primarily with bolt-action rifles, submachine guns, and captured Japanese weapons. North Korean forces used Soviet-supplied weapons, mostly Mosin-Nagant bolt-action rifles and PPSH submachine guns. Neither side had semi-automatic rifles issued at the scale American forces did. In firefights, American soldiers could deliver sustained, accurate fire that enemy forces couldn't match. The firepower advantage that had worked in World War II continued working in Korea. Chinese tactics in Korea relied heavily on mass assaults, human wave attacks, hundreds or thousands of soldiers attacking at night, using darkness and numbers to overwhelm positions. The attacks were terrifying and often effective, but they were also costly. American defenders with M1s could deliver devastating fire into massed formations. One rifle firing 40 rounds per minute was effective. A squad of 8 men firing simultaneously was overwhelming. A company of 150 men created an impenetrable wall of fire. Chinese forces took horrific casualties in these assaults, but they kept attacking because their tactical doctrine emphasized overwhelming defenders through sheer numbers and accepting heavy losses to achieve objectives. The M1 proved especially valuable in the defensive battles that characterized much of the Korean War. American and United Nations forces often found themselves defending hills or ridgelines against numerically superior Chinese or North Korean attacks. Defenders with M1s could inflict casualties at rates that made assaults prohibitively expensive. The rifle's sustained fire capability allowed soldiers to engage multiple targets rapidly without pausing to work bolts. In night attacks, when visibility was limited and targets appeared suddenly at close range, that rapid fire capability was decisive. In 1957, the M14 replaced the M1 Garand as standard United States military issue. The M14 was essentially an improved Garand, selective fire capability, detachable 20-round magazine, but the same basic gas operating system. John C. Garand himself worked on the M14 design team. The rifle that replaced his original design was built on principles he had established in the 1930s. The concept of giving every infantryman semi-automatic or automatic firepower had proven so effective that it became the standard worldwide. Today, every modern military uses rifles that fire semi-automatically or automatically. The idea of equipping infantry with bolt-action rifles as primary weapons is obsolete. That obsolescence began with the M1 Garand. John Canaday Garand was born in Quebec in 1888. He emigrated to the United States at age 11 with his family. They settled in Connecticut, where Garand worked in textile mills as a young man. He showed early aptitude for mechanical design and taught himself engineering through observation and practice. He studied machinery, took things apart to understand how they worked, rebuilt them with improvements. By his 20s, Garand had developed a reputation as a skilled machinist and designer. The United States Army was looking for a semi-automatic rifle in the early 1920s. Multiple designers submitted proposals. The Army wanted a rifle that could fire rapidly without manual operation between shots, but that would also be reliable, accurate, and simple enough for mass production. Garand submitted his first design in 1920. It didn't win the competition, but it showed promise. The Army invited him to continue development. Garand joined Springfield Armory in 1919 as a civilian designer. For the next 17 years, he refined his semi-automatic rifle design. The technical challenges were substantial. A semi-automatic rifle had to capture some of the propellant gases from firing and use that energy to operate the action automatically. The gas had to be directed through a port in the barrel, push a piston or operating rod backward, unlock the bolt, extract the spent cartridge, cock the hammer, compress a spring, then let the spring push everything forward again to chamber a new round. All of this had to happen in a fraction of a second, reliably thousands of times in all conditions. Garand tested multiple gas operating systems. He tried different port locations, different rod designs, different bolt mechanisms. Each iteration was built by hand, tested extensively, then refined based on results. The development process was methodical and time-consuming. By the early 1930s, Garand had settled on a gas port system located near the muzzle. Gas tapped from the barrel pushed an operating rod backward under the barrel. The rod was connected to a rotating bolt. As the rod moved back, it rotated the bolt to unlock it, then extracted the spent cartridge. A spring compressed during the rearward movement. When the spring pushed forward, it chambered a new round and rotated the bolt to lock it. The ammunition feeding system took years to develop. Early designs used detachable box magazines, but Army Ordnance Department officials objected. They believed detachable magazines would be easily lost by soldiers in combat. They wanted a fixed internal magazine. Garand developed the en-bloc clip system. 8 rounds were loaded into a metal clip. The entire clip was inserted into the magazine from the top. The clip stayed inside the rifle until all 8 rounds were fired, then ejected automatically. The system was elegant and simple. It allowed for fast reloading and kept the magazine internal as ordnance wanted. The M1 Garand was officially adopted by the United States Army in January 1936. Production began slowly at Springfield Armory. Each rifle required extensive machining. Components had to be manufactured to tight tolerances. The gas system had to be precisely tuned. Early production was maybe a few hundred rifles per month. As workers gained experience and tooling improved, production increased. By 1938, Springfield was producing several thousand M1s per month. When the Army finally adopted Garand's rifle, he received no royalties. As a government employee working at a government facility, all his designs belonged to the United States. The patent was issued in the government's name. Garand never became wealthy from the rifle that bore his name. He continued working at Springfield Armory, refining the design, solving problems that emerged during production and field use. He worked on other projects, too. He helped develop the M14 rifle that would eventually replace the M1. He retired from Springfield Armory in 1953 after 34 years of service and lived quietly in Massachusetts until his death on February 16, 1974, at age 86. Garand's obituary mentioned his work on the M1 but didn't emphasize the rifle's impact on military history. That impact became clearer over time. Military historians studying World War II consistently cite the M1 Garand as one of the critical advantages American forces possessed. Not because it made soldiers better fighters, but because it let them fight more effectively. Courage and training matter, but tools matter too. The Garand was a better tool than anything Axis powers fielded at comparable scale. That simple fact cascaded across thousands of engagements. It shifted odds in countless firefights. It saved lives. It contributed measurably to Allied victory. The lesson from the Garand's development and deployment is straightforward. Technology matters in combat. The side with better tools has an advantage that training and courage alone cannot overcome. Japanese and German soldiers were brave, disciplined, well-trained. Many were veterans of years of combat. They knew their weapons. They knew their tactics. They fought skillfully and courageously. But American soldiers carried rifles that fired as fast as they could pull the trigger, while their opponents had to manually cycle bolts between shots. That mechanical advantage shifted the balance of countless engagements. The Garand didn't eliminate danger. Combat remained deadly. Soldiers with M1s were killed by enemy fire, artillery mortars, grenades, and all the other hazards of war. The rifle didn't make anyone invulnerable, but it gave American soldiers better odds in direct firefights. Better odds meant more soldiers survived, more engagements were won, more objectives were achieved. Over the course of a war involving millions of soldiers and thousands of battles, those incremental advantages accumulated into significant strategic impact. Consider the mathematics. In a typical infantry firefight at 200 yards range, a soldier with a Springfield bolt action might fire 15 aimed shots per minute. A soldier with an M1 Garand might fire 40. That's not quite triple, but close. In a 10-minute engagement, that's 150 rounds versus 400. Now multiply that across a squad of 8 men, a platoon of 40, a company of 150. The firepower difference becomes overwhelming. Defenders can engage more targets, suppress more enemy positions, maintain fire during counterattacks. The cumulative effect changes how battles develop. Enemy commanders notice this repeatedly. German after-action reports from Normandy describe American suppression fire as far heavier than expected based on unit size. Japanese commanders in the Pacific reported similar observations. Soviet observers who studied American tactics noted the firepower advantage that M1 rifles provided. The rifle became part of American tactical doctrine. Infantry attacks relied on sustained suppressive fire to pin defenders while assault elements maneuvered. Defensive positions relied on rapid response fire to break up attacks before they could develop momentum. All of this was possible because the basic infantry weapon could fire rapidly without manual operation. The strategic implications extended beyond individual battles. American forces could afford to be more aggressive because they had firepower advantages. Commanders could commit smaller forces to missions that would require larger forces with inferior weapons. Logistics were simplified because fewer soldiers could achieve the same effects. Casualty rates were lower because firefights were won more quickly with less exposure to enemy fire. These advantages compounded across campaigns. The M1 Garand was one factor among many that contributed to Allied victory, but it was a significant factor. The rifle also influenced post-war military thinking worldwide. After 1945, every major military began programs to develop or acquire semi-automatic or automatic rifles. The Soviet Union had already deployed the SKS semi-automatic carbine during the war and continued development of automatic rifles. The British developed the EM2 rifle and later adopted the L1A1. France developed the MS-49. Germany later developed the G3. Every nation recognized that the era of bolt-action infantry rifles was over. The American M1 had demonstrated that semi-automatic rifles were practical, reliable, and decisively superior in combat. That lesson was absorbed by military planners everywhere. 5.4 million M1 Garand rifles were built between 1937 and 1945. Those rifles were carried by millions of soldiers across every theater of World War II. They delivered firepower that changed how infantry fought. The semi-automatic rifle became the standard. Bolt action became obsolete. The weapon that drove that transition, that proved the concept decisively under combat conditions across every environment, was the M1 Garand, a rifle designed by an immigrant engineer from Quebec, built by American workers in Massachusetts and Connecticut, carried by American soldiers from Manila to Berlin. That rifle gave every infantryman firepower that previous generations, reserved for machine gun crews. It spread lethal capability across the entire infantry line. It worked in every condition, under fire, under pressure, when lives depended on it. The M1 Garand worked. That simple fact saved thousands of American lives and changed modern warfare forever.